Marcus Wellington stepped out of his black Bentley, adjusting his expensive Italian suit as he surveyed the grand entrance of Buckingham Palace. The 42-year-old American tech billionaire had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way to the top of Silicon Valley's most ruthless companies. His latest acquisition had made headlines worldwide, and now he was in London to finalize a deal worth over £2 billion with British investors. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Marcus walked. With his entourage of lawyers and assistants, his success had inflated his ego to dangerous proportions. He believed money could buy anything, including respect from anyone, regardless of their position or tradition. The man who had once been a humble programmer from Detroit now saw himself as untouchable, a modern king of commerce who deserved recognition wherever he went. As they approached the palace gates, Marcus noticed the iconic red uniformed guards standing at attention. These were the Queen's Guard, soldiers from elite regiments who had protected British royalty for centuries. Their tall black bearskin hats and stoic expressions had become symbols of British tradition and discipline. Most tourists respectfully observed these ceremonial sentries from a distance, understanding the gravity of their duty and the protocol surrounding their service. But Marcus was not most tourists. His assistant, Sarah, noticed the gleam in his eye as he stared at the guards. She had worked for him for 3 years and recognized that look. It was the same expression he wore before making bold, often reckless decisions in boardrooms across the world. The same look that had both made him billions and earned him countless enemies in the business world. "Sir, perhaps we should proceed to the meeting," Sarah suggested quietly, sensing trouble brewing. The appointment with Lord Pemberton and the investment consortium was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and they were already cutting it close. The British were notoriously punctual, and keeping such important figures waiting would not make a good impression. Marcus waved her off dismissively, his attention fixed entirely on the guards. He had always believed that power was about making others acknowledge your superiority. In his mind, these soldiers were simply employees, no different from the security guards at his corporate headquarters. The idea that they might not recognize his importance or show him special deference was inconceivable to him. The businessman pulled out his phone and began recording, planning to share whatever happened next on his social media accounts. His millions of followers loved watching him assert dominance in various situations around the world. Whether it was demanding special treatment at exclusive restaurants or getting VIP access to sold-out events, Marcus had built part of his brand around demonstrating how money and influence could open any door. He approached the nearest guard, a young man who stood perfectly still despite the growing crowd of onlookers. The soldier's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his rifle held at the precise angle required by centuries of military tradition. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease exactly where it should be. This was Guardsman James Morrison, a decorated veteran who had served tours in Afghanistan and took his ceremonial duties as seriously as he had taken combat operations. Marcus stopped directly in front of the guard, close enough that most people would consider it an invasion of personal space. He expected some reaction, perhaps a slight acknowledgement of his presence. When none came, his irritation began to grow. The crowd around them started to take notice, with several tourists pulling out their own phones to record what was clearly becoming an unusual situation. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The question was meant to establish his importance, to force the guard to break protocol and acknowledge the presence of someone significant. In Marcus's world, everyone knew who he was. His face had been on magazine covers, his name mentioned in financial news broadcasts around the globe. The guard remained motionless, his training taking precedence over any curiosity about the man standing before him. The Queen's Guard were taught to maintain their composure regardless of provocation, whether from unruly tourists, protesters, or in this case, entitled billionaires. Their duty was to the crown, not to the ego of visiting businessmen, no matter how wealthy or influential they claimed to be. Marcus's frustration mounted with each passing second of silence. He was accustomed to immediate responses, to people jumping to attention when he spoke. The guard's refusal to even acknowledge his question felt like a personal insult. In his mind, this was not about respect for tradition or military protocol. It was about a simple soldier refusing to show proper deference to his obvious superiority. The crowd continued to grow, with whispers spreading about the American businessman who seemed determined to provoke a reaction from the ceremonial guard. Some onlookers shook their heads in disapproval, recognizing the inappropriate nature of his behavior. Others watched with morbid curiosity, wondering how far he would push the situation. Sarah stood at a distance, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She knew her boss well enough to realize this was far from over. Marcus Wellington never backed down from a challenge, especially not when he felt his authority was being questioned. The meeting with the British investors seemed forgotten, as his entire focus narrowed to the stoic soldier standing before him. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus Wellington circled the motionless guard like a predator, stalking its prey. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the ancient stones of the palace courtyard, each step echoing his growing frustration. The businessman had never encountered someone who completely ignored his presence, and the experience was both infuriating and fascinating to him. "I'm Marcus Wellington," he announced loudly, as if the name itself should command instant respect. "I own Wellington Technologies worth over $15 billion. I've had dinner with presidents and prime ministers." His voice carried across the courtyard, drawing even more attention from tourists and passers-by. Several members of the nearby crowd began taking photos and videos, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Guardsman Morrison remained absolutely still, his breathing steady and controlled. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. The Queen's Guard regularly dealt with tourists who tried to provoke reactions, but this was different. This wasn't a playful attempt to make a soldier smile or move. This was a direct challenge to the authority and tradition he represented. Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through news articles about himself, holding the screen close to the guard's face. "Look, this is me on the cover of Forbes magazine last month. The most influential tech leader under 50, he read aloud. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, all watching this bizarre confrontation between American wealth and British tradition. "I demand that you salute me," Marcus declared suddenly, his voice rising with authority. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, causing audible gasps from several onlookers. Even tourists unfamiliar with British military protocol understood that this was an outrageous request. The Queen's Guard saluted only specific individuals as dictated by strict military regulations and royal protocol. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd stepped forward slightly, his face red with indignation. "Young man, you can't simply demand such a thing," he called out. "Those guards represent Her Majesty and centuries of tradition." His accent was refined, suggesting education and possibly military background himself. Marcus spun around to face the man, his eyes blazing with arrogance. "And I represent the future," he shot back. "I employ over 50,000 people worldwide. My company's technology is used by millions every day. If that doesn't deserve recognition, then what does?" His entitlement was breathtaking in its scope, revealing a man who had lost all perspective on his place in the world. The businessman turned back to the guard, stepping even closer until he was mere inches away. "I know you can hear me," he said in a lower, more menacing tone. "I'm not some random tourist with a camera. I'm somebody important, and I expect to be treated as such." The veins in his neck were beginning to show as his blood pressure rose with his frustration. Sarah finally worked up the courage to approach her boss, her heels clicking nervously on the stone ground. "Mr. Wellington, please," she whispered urgently. "We're going to be late for the meeting with Lord Pemberton. This could jeopardize the entire deal." The investment consortium they were meeting represented old British money, families whose wealth stretched back centuries and who valued tradition above all else. Marcus waved her away with such force that she stumbled backward. "The deal will wait," he snapped. "Right now I'm teaching this toy soldier about respect." His words dripped with contempt, showing complete disregard for the military service and dedication of the man standing before him. The crowd's murmur grew louder as people began discussing what they were witnessing. Several tourists from other countries looked embarrassed by Marcus's behavior, while British onlookers appeared increasingly offended. A few people had started calling for police intervention, though others seemed content to watch the drama unfold. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, thick with cash and credit cards. "Maybe you need motivation," he said, pulling out a stack of 50-pound notes. "What's your annual salary?" 30,040. "This is probably more than you make in a month." He waved the money in front of the guard's face, his desperation becoming more apparent with each passing moment. The insult was profound, suggesting that the soldier's dedication to duty could be bought with pocket change from a wealthy tourist. For Guardsman Morrison, who had risked his life for his country and took immense pride in his service, the gesture was deeply offensive. Yet his training held firm, his expression never changing despite the internal struggle between duty and dignity. A woman in the crowd began filming more deliberately, her phone held high to capture every moment. "This is going straight to social media," she announced to her companion. "Can you believe this American thinks he can buy a salute from the Queen's Guard?" Her voice carried clearly, adding another layer of humiliation to Marcus's increasingly desperate performance. Marcus heard her comment and spun around, his face now completely flushed with anger and embarrassment. The realization that his behavior was being broadcast to the world should have caused him to reconsider, but instead, it only fueled his determination to prove his point. He had built his reputation on never backing down, on always getting what he wanted through persistence and force of will. "Fine," he said, turning back to the guard with renewed determination. "If money won't work, maybe authority will." He pulled out his phone and began making a call, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Get me the British ambassador to the United States," he barked into the device. "This is Marcus Wellington, and I need immediate assistance at Buckingham Palace." The phone call to the British ambassador was pure theater, designed to intimidate both the guard and the growing crowd of onlookers. Marcus paced back and forth as he spoke, his voice booming across the courtyard with exaggerated importance. "Yes, this is Marcus Wellington of Wellington Technologies," he announced into his phone. "I'm currently at Buckingham Palace, and I'm experiencing some difficulties with your military personnel." What the crowd didn't know was that Marcus was actually speaking to his own secretary back in California, who was playing along with his charade. She had been instructed years ago to pretend to be various officials whenever he needed to make a show of his supposed connections. It was a pathetic display of manufactured power, but Marcus had used this tactic successfully in business negotiations around the world. Guardsman Morrison remained perfectly still throughout the performance. Though seasoned observers might have noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes, the soldier had seen enough real authority during his military career to recognize fake posturing when he encountered it. Generals and commanding officers carried themselves differently than this desperate businessman flailing about with his phone and money. "I'm a major investor in British companies." Marcus continued his fictional conversation. "I employ hundreds of British citizens in my London offices. Surely that warrants some basic respect from your ceremonial guards." He was creating an elaborate narrative of his own importance, each lie building upon the previous one until he had constructed a fantasy of diplomatic immunity and special privileges. An older woman in the crowd, clearly a local Londoner, shook her head in disgust. "Embarrassing," she muttered to her companion. "Absolutely embarrassing. These guards have served in war zones, and this fool thinks his money makes him special." Her words carried clearly, causing several other onlookers to nod in agreement. Marcus ended his fake phone call with a theatrical flourish. "They're looking into this immediately," he announced to the crowd as if expecting applause for his imaginary connections. "I expect this situation will be resolved very shortly." His confidence seemed restored, built on the foundation of his elaborate deception. But Guardsman Morrison didn't move. Not even a twitch. The soldier's commitment to his duty remained absolute, unaffected by false claims of diplomatic intervention or imaginary phone calls to ambassadors. His stillness was becoming more powerful than any words could have been, a silent testament to principles that couldn't be bought or bullied. Marcus's fake confidence began to crack as the minutes ticked by with no change in the guard's position. The businessman had expected his display of connections to intimidate the soldier into compliance, but instead, he found himself facing the same immovable figure as before. The crowd was growing restless, and some people were beginning to laugh quietly at his increasingly desperate antics. "This is ridiculous," Marcus declared, his voice now carrying a note of panic beneath the bluster. "I've been more than patient. I've tried to handle this diplomatically." He gestured wildly at his phone as if the device itself proved his importance. "But now I'm going to have to insist that you show proper respect." A security guard from the nearby gift shop had noticed the commotion and was slowly making his way through the crowd. His presence added a new element of tension to the situation, suggesting that Marcus's behavior was finally drawing official attention. The businessman was too focused on his confrontation with the ceremonial guard to notice this development. Marcus decided to try a different approach, attempting to appeal to what he imagined was the soldier's sense of practical economics. "Look, I understand you have a job to do," he said, his tone becoming falsely reasonable. "But surely you can make an exception for someone who contributes as much to the British economy as I do. My investments create jobs, generate tax revenue, support families." The argument was deeply flawed, suggesting that economic contribution somehow trumped military protocol and centuries of tradition. It revealed Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of what the Queen's Guard represented. These soldiers weren't customer service representatives who could bend rules for valued clients. They were guardians of something far more significant than quarterly profits. Sarah had retreated to the edge of the crowd, her face pale with embarrassment and growing concern. She knew that videos of this confrontation would be online within hours, potentially damaging her boss's reputation and their business relationships in the UK. The investment meeting they were supposed to attend would likely be cancelled if Lord Pemberton's people saw footage of Marcus harassing the Queen's Guard. A young man in the crowd had been live-streaming the entire incident on social media, providing real-time commentary to his growing audience of viewers. "This American billionaire has been trying to force this guard to salute him for over 10 minutes now," he narrated quietly. "The guard hasn't moved a muscle. It's like watching someone try to argue with a statue." Marcus overheard the commentary and spun around to face the live streamer. "Turn that off," he demanded, pointing aggressively at the phone. "This is a private conversation." The irony of calling a public confrontation in front of Buckingham Palace a private conversation was lost on him entirely. "It's a public space." "Mate," the young man replied calmly, continuing to film, "and you're the one making a scene." His response drew approving murmurs from several other onlookers, who were clearly enjoying watching the entitled businessman being challenged by ordinary citizens. Marcus realized he was losing control of the narrative. What had started as a simple demand for recognition had spiraled into a public humiliation. His anger reached a boiling point as he turned back to the motionless guard, his face now completely red with rage and frustration. "I'm ordering you to salute me," he screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm a successful businessman. I'm important. I deserve respect." The words came out as a desperate plea disguised as a command, revealing the deep insecurity that drove his constant need for validation. Marcus Wellington's composure completely shattered as he realized that his wealth, his threats, and his fabricated authority had no effect on the stoic guardian before him. The billionaire who had bulldozed his way through corporate boardrooms and intimidated world leaders found himself powerless against a young soldier who simply refused to acknowledge his existence. In a moment of pure desperation, Marcus reached out and actually touched the guard's uniform, tugging at the red fabric of his tunic. The gesture sent a shockwave through the crowd, as everyone knew that touching the Queen's Guard was strictly forbidden. Gasps echoed across the courtyard and several people shouted warnings, but it was too late to prevent the violation. Guardsman Morrison's training kicked in immediately. Without breaking his stoic expression or looking directly at Marcus, he spoke in a clear, authoritative voice that cut through the morning air like a blade. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard," he commanded, his words carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition and unwavering discipline. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the sudden break in the guard's seemingly statue-like demeanor. Marcus stumbled backward, equally shocked by the soldier's voice. For the first time in the confrontation, he seemed to realize that he was dealing with a real person, not a living decoration for tourists to admire. But Marcus's ego wouldn't allow him to retreat. Instead of apologizing for his inappropriate behavior, he became even more aggressive. "Now you're talking," he said with a nervous laugh, trying to regain his composure. "I knew you could speak, so let's discuss this like civilized men. All I want is a simple salute. Is that really too much to ask?" The security officer who had been approaching through the crowd finally reached the scene. He was a tall, professional-looking man in a dark blue uniform, clearly experienced in handling difficult situations at one of London's most visited tourist attractions. His presence immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the guard," the security officer said firmly, positioning himself between Marcus and Guardsman Morrison. "You're creating a disturbance, and physical contact with the Queen's Guard is not permitted under any circumstances." Marcus turned his attention to the security officer, seeing him as a new target for his frustration. "Do you know who I am?" He repeated his familiar refrain, as if the question itself was a magic spell that would solve all his problems. "I'm Marcus Wellington. I run a multi-billion-dollar company. I'm not some random troublemaker." The security officer remained unimpressed by the name-dropping. He had dealt with entitled celebrities, politicians, and business people before, and their wealth never gave them the right to harass the ceremonial guards. "I don't care who you are, sir," he replied calmly. "The rules apply to everyone equally." The live streamer in the crowd was having a field day, providing running commentary to his online audience. "The security guard just told this billionaire that the rules apply to everyone," he whispered excitedly. You can see the American guy's face turning purple with rage. This is absolutely incredible television. Marcus's assistant Sarah finally found the courage to intervene more forcefully. She pushed through the crowd and grabbed her boss's arm, her usually professional demeanor cracking under the stress of the situation. "Mr. Wellington, we need to leave immediately," she hissed in his ear. "Lord Pemberton's office has been calling. They're threatening to cancel the meeting if we don't arrive in the next 15 minutes. The mention of the canceled meeting should have snapped Marcus back to reality, but he was too far gone to think rationally about business consequences. His entire identity was built on the idea that money and success commanded universal respect, and the guard's continued indifference challenged everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. "I'm not leaving until I get what I came for," Marcus declared, shaking off Sarah's grip. "I've traveled 3,000 miles for this business trip, and I won't be disrespected by some toy soldier who probably makes less in a year than I spend on lunch." The crowd's murmur grew louder as people discussed the escalating situation among themselves. Several tourists were openly expressing their disgust with Marcus's behavior, while others seemed fascinated by the spectacle of watching a powerful man completely lose control in public. An elderly gentleman who had been quietly observing from the beginning stepped forward, his military bearing suggesting he was a veteran himself. "Young man," he addressed Marcus with dignity and authority, "these guards have served with honor in Afghanistan and Iraq. They've earned their positions through dedication and sacrifice, not through inherited wealth or business success." Marcus whirled around to face the veteran, his anger now directed at yet another target. "And what have you done lately?" he sneered. "When was the last time you created jobs or drove innovation? When did you last contribute anything meaningful to society?" His words revealed the shallow nature of his understanding of service and contribution. The veteran's eyes hardened, but his voice remained steady. "I served 30 years in Her Majesty's forces," he replied quietly. "But even if I hadn't, I would know better than to harass a man doing his duty." The simple dignity of his response made Marcus's ranting seem even more petulant and childish. Guardsman Morrison had returned to his position of silent attention, but the tension in his shoulders was visible to those who looked closely. The physical contact and continued harassment were testing his professional restraint, though his training continued to hold firm against the provocation. The security officer was now speaking into his radio, calling for additional support. The situation was clearly beyond what one person could handle, especially with the crowd growing larger and Marcus showing no signs of backing down. The prospect of arrest was becoming very real, though the businessman seemed oblivious to the legal consequences of his behavior. Marcus made one final, desperate attempt to assert his authority over the situation. He pulled out his phone and began recording a video, speaking directly into the camera with the manic energy of a man whose worldview was crumbling around him. With his phone held high, Marcus began recording what he believed would be his vindication video. "This is Marcus Wellington reporting live from Buckingham Palace," he announced to his camera, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "I'm being denied basic courtesy by these so-called professional guards. This is how Britain treats major international investors." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the billionaire continued his self-recorded rant, completely unaware of how deranged he appeared to observers. His expensive suit was wrinkled from his agitated movements, his hair disheveled, and his face flushed red with exertion and frustration. The polished businessman who had arrived an hour earlier was gone, replaced by a man having a very public breakdown. "My followers deserve to see this," Marcus continued, panning his camera toward Guardsman Morrison. "This is what happens when you try to show respect for British tradition, but receive none in return. I asked for a simple salute, a basic acknowledgement of mutual respect between professionals. But as Marcus filmed, something extraordinary began to happen. The crowd around him started to organize itself in an unexpected way. The elderly veteran who had spoken earlier stepped forward and, without saying a word, came to attention and saluted Guardsman Morrison. His crisp military bearing and precise movement created a moment of profound dignity amidst the chaos. Seeing this gesture, other people in the crowd began to follow suit. A young woman who appeared to be a nurse stepped forward and placed her hand over her heart in a gesture of respect. A man wearing a fire department t-shirt stood straight and nodded formally toward the guard. One by one, ordinary citizens began, showing the respect and recognition that Marcus had demanded for himself. The spontaneous display of appreciation for the guard service was both beautiful and devastating to Marcus's narrative. Here were regular people without billions of dollars or corporate empires, demonstrating the very respect that he claimed was being unfairly denied to him. The difference was that their gestures came from genuine appreciation rather than entitled demand. Marcus's camera captured it all, though he was too focused on his own monologue to realize what was happening behind him. The live streamer, however, was providing real-time commentary that perfectly captured the irony of the situation. "Incredible scenes here," he whispered to his audience. "While this billionaire demands a salute, ordinary people are spontaneously showing real respect to the guard." A small girl, no more than 8 years old, tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something in his ear. The man nodded and lifted her up so she could wave properly at Guardsman Morrison. The soldier's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly toward the child, and the slightest hint of warmth crossed his features before returning to his professional composure. The security officer had been joined by 2 colleagues, and they were now conferring quietly about how to handle the increasingly complex situation. Marcus was clearly disturbing the peace, but he hadn't technically committed any serious crimes beyond touching the guard's uniform. The challenge was de-escalating the situation without creating an even bigger scene. Sarah, meanwhile, had received another urgent call from Lord Pemberton's office. The investment consortium had heard about the incident through their own sources, and were expressing serious concerns about doing business with someone who would publicly harass British military personnel. The multi-billion-pound deal that had brought them to London was rapidly disintegrating. "Mr. Wellington," Sarah called out desperately, "Lord Pemberton's people are saying they may need to reconsider the entire partnership. They're calling your behavior conduct unbecoming of a business leader." Her voice cracked as she delivered the news, knowing that this incident could cost both of them their careers. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus seemed to register that his actions had real consequences beyond his bruised ego. He lowered his phone slightly and looked around the crowd, finally noticing the dozens of people who were now openly showing support for the guard while viewing him with obvious disdain. But instead of recognizing his mistake, Marcus doubled down on his position. "They don't understand," he muttered, raising his phone again. "This is about principle. This is about respect for achievement and success. These people don't know what it takes to build something from nothing." The veteran in the crowd had heard enough. He stepped closer to Marcus, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. "Son," he said firmly, "respect isn't something you can demand or buy. It's something you earn through your actions, and right now, your actions are bringing shame to your country and embarrassment to everyone watching." Marcus spun around to face the veteran, his phone still recording. "Who are you to lecture me about shame?" he demanded. "I've built an empire. I employ thousands of people. I've achieved more in 40 years than most people achieve in a lifetime." His desperation was becoming more apparent with each word, as if saying these things loudly enough would make them matter in this context. The veteran's response was quiet, but devastating in its simplicity. "And yet you're here, screaming at a young man who's doing his duty with honor and dignity. What does that say about your achievements?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Marcus to confront the contradiction between his claims of success and his current behavior. As if summoned by the growing tension, Two Metropolitan Police officers appeared at the edge of the crowd. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere, as everyone suddenly became aware that the situation was approaching a point where legal action might become necessary. The tourists began backing away slightly, creating a clearer space around the main participants in the drama. Guardsman Morrison remained at his post throughout all of this, his composure never wavering despite the chaos swirling around him. His stillness had become the eye of the storm, a fixed point of dignity and professionalism that made Marcus's frantic behavior appear even more erratic by comparison. The young soldier had won this confrontation simply by refusing to participate in it. The arrival of the Metropolitan Police officers created a sobering moment of clarity that cut through Marcus's manic energy like a cold wind. For the first time since his confrontation began, he seemed to truly understand that his behavior had crossed a line that money and influence couldn't erase. The officers approached with professional calm, but their presence carried an unmistakable message about the seriousness of the situation. "Good morning, sir," the lead officer addressed Marcus with polite firmness. "We've received reports of a disturbance involving harassment of ceremonial guards. I'm going to need to ask you some questions." The officer's tone was respectful but left no doubt about his authority to intervene in the situation. Marcus's phone trembled in his hand as he finally stopped recording his increasingly desperate monologue. The reality of potentially being arrested at Buckingham Palace was beginning to penetrate his fog of entitlement. "Officer, this is all a misunderstanding," he began, his voice now noticeably less confident than it had been moments earlier. The second police officer was speaking quietly with the security guards and several witnesses from the crowd, gathering information about what had transpired. The live streamer eagerly offered to share his video footage, explaining that he had captured the entire incident from the beginning. The thoroughness of the documentation would make it impossible for Marcus to claim that events had unfolded differently than they actually had. Sarah seized this moment of distraction to make one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. She approached the lead officer with her hands raised in a gesture of cooperation. "Officer, I'm Mr. Wellington's assistant. I want to apologize profusely for this incident. My employer has been under tremendous stress with international business negotiations, and I believe the pressure has affected his judgment." The excuse sounded hollow even to Sarah's own ears, but she was grasping for any explanation that might minimize the consequences of her boss's behavior. The officer listened politely, but showed no sign of being swayed by appeals to business stress or international importance. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown to nearly 100 people, with tourists and locals alike drawn by the spectacle of watching a wealthy American businessman face the consequences of his arrogance. Many were still filming, ensuring that this incident would be preserved and shared across social media platforms within hours. The veteran who had confronted Marcus earlier approached Guardsman Morrison with dignified purpose. "Thank you for your service, son," he said quietly, offering a crisp military salute that spoke of decades of respect for uniform and duty. The young guard's eyes flickered with acknowledgement, though he maintained his professional composure. This simple exchange highlighted everything that Marcus had fundamentally misunderstood about respect and recognition. The veteran's salute wasn't demanded or purchased. It was freely given based on shared understanding of service and sacrifice. It represented exactly the kind of authentic respect that Marcus desperately craved but could never command through wealth or bluster. Marcus watched this interaction with growing horror as he began to comprehend the depth of his miscalculation. The very thing he had been demanding for himself was being freely offered by someone who understood its true meaning. His failure wasn't just tactical. It was philosophical, revealing his complete misunderstanding of human dignity and earned respect. The lead police officer finished his consultation with witnesses and returned his attention to Marcus. "Sir, based on witness statements, you've been harassing this guard for nearly an hour, made physical contact with his uniform, and created a significant disturbance. I need to inform you that these actions could constitute several different offenses under British law." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Each phrase represented another nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed image as a successful international businessman. The idea that he could face criminal charges for his behavior was so far outside his normal experience that he struggled to process the information. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from his legal team in London, who had been alerted to the situation by social media posts and news reports. The speed with which word was spreading demonstrated the power of modern communication to instantly broadcast embarrassing incidents to a global audience. Mr. Wellington, his lawyer's voice was tense even through the phone speaker. I'm seeing reports of an incident at Buckingham Palace. Please tell me you're not currently being questioned by police. The concern in the attorney's voice was palpable, suggesting that the legal implications of the situation were indeed serious. Marcus stepped away from the officer to take the call, but his conversation was easily overheard by nearby onlookers. It's not what it looks like, he insisted to his lawyer. I was simply asking for appropriate recognition of my status as an international investor. These people don't understand diplomatic courtesy. The lawyer's response was swift and sharp. Mr. Wellington, there is no diplomatic courtesy that entitles you to demand salutes from ceremonial guards. I need you to apologize immediately and cooperate fully with law enforcement. This incident is already trending on social media, and every minute it continues makes the situation worse. The mention of social media trending caused Marcus to pull out his personal phone and check his notifications. What he saw there delivered the final devastating blow to his ego. Videos of his confrontation were indeed spreading rapidly across multiple platforms, but the public reaction was universally negative. Comments ranged from mockery of his entitled behavior to outrage at his disrespect for military service. One particularly viral clip showed him waving money at the guard while demanding a salute, set to music that made him appear even more ridiculous. Another compilation video contrasted his desperate behavior with the dignified responses of the crowd members who had spontaneously shown respect to Guardsman Morrison. The business news networks had also picked up the story, with headlines describing him as the billionaire who lost his mind at Buckingham Palace and American execs. Meltdown goes viral. His company's stock price was already beginning to fluctuate as investors reacted to the negative publicity. Marcus's world was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to millions of viewers around the globe. The man who had built his reputation on projecting strength and control was watching it evaporate in the most public way possible, all because he couldn't accept that his money didn't make him worthy of a soldier's salute. As the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him, Marcus Wellington found himself truly speechless for the first time in decades. The man who had commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and addressed crowds of thousands stood frozen in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, unable to form coherent words. His phone trembled in his hand as he scrolled through the endless stream of comments, shares, and news articles documenting his complete public humiliation. The police officer cleared his throat, drawing Marcus's attention back to the immediate legal consequences of his actions. Sir, I need your full attention. Given the circumstances and the public nature of this incident, I'm prepared to offer you a choice. You can accept a formal caution for disturbing the peace and harassment, which will be recorded but won't require court proceedings, or we can pursue this through the formal legal system. Marcus's lawyer, still on the phone, was virtually shouting advice about accepting the caution immediately. The legal professional understood that any court proceeding would generate even more negative publicity and potentially result in more serious consequences. Take the caution, Mr. Wellington, the lawyer urged, and then we need to begin immediate damage control. But Marcus was barely listening. His attention was fixed on Guardsman Morrison, who continued to stand at perfect attention despite everything that had transpired. The young soldier's unwavering composure in the face of harassment, threats, and chaos had revealed something profound about the nature of true strength and dignity. Everything Marcus thought he knew about power and respect had been turned upside down by this encounter. The crowd began to disperse as it became clear that the confrontation was reaching its conclusion. Many people approached Guardsman Morrison to offer quiet words of thanks and support, creating an impromptu receiving line of genuine appreciation. Children waved, veterans saluted, and ordinary citizens simply nodded with respect. The guard acknowledged each gesture with the slightest movement of his eyes, maintaining his professional bearing while clearly being moved by the support. Sarah had finally managed to cancel their meeting with Lord Pemberton's investment consortium. Though the damage to that business relationship was irreversible, the British investors had made it clear that they would never work with someone who had so publicly disrespected their country's military traditions. Years of careful business development, had been destroyed in a single morning of entitled behavior. The veteran who had confronted Marcus earlier approached him one final time as the police were preparing to process the formal caution. "Son," he said quietly, "I hope you learned something today about what real honor looks like. That young man standing guard has served his country with distinction, and he'll continue to do so regardless of what happened here. The question is what you'll do with this experience." Marcus looked up at the older man, his face a mask of shock and confusion. For the first time, he seemed to truly see the people around him as individuals rather than obstacles to his will. The veteran's weathered features spoke of decades of service and sacrifice, while Guardsman Morrison's steady presence represented a commitment to duty that transcended personal recognition or financial reward. The billionaire opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an explanation or justification for his behavior, but no words came. The magnitude of his miscalculation had rendered him mute. He had built his entire identity around the idea that success and wealth commanded universal respect. But this encounter had proven that the most important forms of respect couldn't be bought, demanded, or leveraged through business connections. As the formal caution was being processed, news vans began arriving at the palace gates. Marcus's public breakdown had become an international story, with networks around the world covering the incident as a symbol of American entitlement, clashing with British tradition. His company's stock continued to slide as investors worried about the reputational damage to the brand. The live streamer who had captured much of the confrontation was being interviewed by arriving journalists, providing expert commentary on the viral phenomenon he had helped document. "It was incredible to watch," he explained to a BBC reporter. "This billionaire just couldn't understand why his money didn't matter to that guard." The soldier never moved, never acknowledged him, just did his duty with perfect professionalism. The irony was devastating. Marcus had come to London seeking respect and recognition for his business achievements, but instead had become a global symbol of everything wrong with entitled wealth. His name, which he had worked decades to build into a brand synonymous with success, was now permanently associated with arrogance, disrespect, and public humiliation. As the police finished their paperwork and prepared to release him with the formal caution, Marcus took one last look at Guardsman Morrison. The young soldier remained at his post, unchanged by the chaos that had swirled around him for the past hour. His composure and dignity had never wavered, providing a stark contrast to Marcus's emotional breakdown. The businessman's expensive car was still waiting where he had left it, but the man who climbed into the back seat was fundamentally different from the one who had emerged earlier that morning. Marcus Wellington, who had demanded a salute from the Queen's Guard, sat in stunned silence as his driver navigated away from Buckingham Palace. The words he had spoken so confidently about deserving respect now echoed mockingly in his mind. Behind them, Guardsman Morrison continued his watch, unmoved by the departure of the man who had tried so desperately to command his recognition. The guard's duty was to the crown and to centuries of military tradition, not to the fragile ego of a visiting businessman. As tourists resumed their normal activities around the palace, the soldier stood ready to face whatever the rest of his shift might bring, his dignity intact and his honor unblemished. Marcus would never speak publicly about what happened that morning at Buckingham Palace. The man who had built his career on bold statements and confident assertions remained speechless about the day he learned that true respect cannot be demanded, purchased, or entitled, but must be earned through character, service, and humility, qualities that no amount of money can buy.